afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining today's event. I'm Elena Aston, Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at RBC, and a member of the Member Engagement Committee for your Toronto chapter of the International Women's Forum Canada. Our 2020 Toronto chapter member engagement survey identified that members want help understanding and preparing for the board membership process and how to be effective as board members. So in response, the Toronto Chapter Member Engagement Committee developed this Board Journey 360 Masterclass series in partnership with Boyden, Canada, to provide expert content and insights to support our members and to continue on from the very great work of our Members on Boards initiative. This Board Journey 360 Masterclass series is available exclusively to IWF Canada Toronto Chapter members. This series is for members who are ready to step into their own board director journey and those already on the journey, with a goal to helping you explore all the required elements from types of boards to recruiting to board service, and then what's beyond. Comprised of a 4-part virtual workshop that includes live instruction, interactive discussion, breakouts, and multiple expert series from both our own membership and from Boyden, this hybrid program delivers insights across the board leadership spectrum, enriched with expert perspectives and through peer-to-peer discussions. Each masterclass will focus on a specific element of the process, and altogether, the 4 parts of the series will provide a 360-degree perspective into the board journey. I would like now to introduce Joanna Gonzalez, our course design partner and Global Senior Director of Marketing from Boyden.
Thank you, Elena. Hello, everyone. It's fantastic to be here with you today. Quick note that we are recording today's session, so anything we share today will also be available to you and to IWF Toronto chapter members very soon. As Elena mentioned, this has been a collaborative process, and let me tell you, you are in good hands. Boyden has a deep commitment to DEI, including global and national DEI partnerships focused on action-oriented approach. We deliver programming regularly on this and related leadership subject matter because we believe it's a critical component of the solution and one that we have a responsibility towards. We have a dedicated CEO and board services practice and proudly share that 45% of our board placements across Canada are women. Our global board is comprised of 63% women, and we have the first female CEO of a global executive search firm. With that, I welcome today's session instructors, Michelle Richard and Ian Collier of Boyden. We will invite our guest speaker, Michelle Savoy, later on in the program. A senior partner and practice member, Michelle Richard works with public, not-for-profit, and private sector clients with focus on bringing private sector talent to governmental departments, agencies, and crown corporations. She's advised some of the most prominent organizations in Canada and played an instrumental role in over 500 senior leaders at the COVP and board level. A partner in Boyden's Toronto office, Ian Collier is a key member of Boyden's technology, e-commerce, and consumer practices. Throughout his 2 decades of experience, Ian has partnered with companies ranging from private equity and venture-backed startups to large multinational organizations. Ian's recent search work includes board director, CEO, and CFO searches for some of Canada's fastest growing organizations. His expertise is in helping these high-growth organizations build outstanding leadership teams as they look to rapidly scale their business. Over to you, Michelle and Ian.
Thanks, everyone. Great to be here.
Joanna. Great to be here. Thank you, everybody. Terrific. And so as we begin this afternoon, let me just walk through a little bit of the session learning objective. So first, we'll learn, of course, how we see boards approaching their own board needs, and particularly around the competency assessments and how they create that through their matrix. We'll also examine how boards determine their needs, right? So starting from the beginning, some of the tools and approaches they take as far as building candidate profiles and selection criteria, as well as evaluating during that process, of course, their own existing boards. And then we'll also talk finally about the board recruitment approach, which is as well where Boyden typically comes in, and how those approaches might differ from sector to sector, from crown corporations, nonprofits, publicly traded organizations to private organizations.
So this is instructional in nature, and so we'll spend about 30 minutes going through different concepts. And in fact, either as a board member or a candidate, some of the concepts and methodologies may be familiar to you, but we're hoping to share some insights from the inside and the background of what we do on a day-to-day basis. We'll try and pepper that up with some Q&As throughout the process before going into our fireside chat with Michelle Savoy a little later on. We're looking forward to the session together.
Sure. So how boards are approaching currently their own assessment, right, which is an important factor to consider, and it has been a shifting landscape. And you know, as we've talked and pulling together this this talk, you know, we drew upon a lot of our recent experiences talking to CEOs and boards as they've looked at the change out and to build out their boards. So there's a few common factors we've been seeing across really many industries, and one of them is an increased sensitivity to being overboarded. Both on the candidate side, so current directors, as well as from the board's perspective as they look to bring aboard board directors. And certainly this is, you know, I think a continuation of the expectation that board directors are quite active in their involvement. And it's not just a rubber stamp anymore, you're quite active in your involvement, and there's a significant time commitment that can be involved with that. So no doubt that's one of the first things that we talked about with prospective candidates. Also seeing some new skill sets, you know, coming on the horizon of boards that we probably wouldn't have seen even 5 or 6 years ago. One of them is digital, and all things really across the digital spectrum. You've obviously heard about the ransomware attacks that we've seen in the US that have happened in other organizations, maybe not so publicly. So that certainly cybersecurity has been an increased demand, seeing clients ask us for that skill set. As well, more broadly, you know, the last year with COVID, we've seen probably the largest digital transformation across multiple sectors, like in our lifetimes, right? And so, along with that, there's been a real acknowledgement that digital is important, and we have seen recently across multiple sectors, from healthcare to private sector, you know, boards looking to add digital experts, whether it's CIOs or et cetera, to their board. Also seeing, of course, ESG and risk management continually being important. And maybe the difference, you know, we are seeing as from an ESG perspective, you know, it's not really a rubber stamp type thing anymore. It's actually companies are realizing there's opportunity and value creation, long-term opportunities, I should say, around ESG, and in fact, market opportunities around this, and are so looking to be thoughtful as they build out their boards to add that component, realizing it's a competitive element as well as doing the right thing. We are seeing, of course, we're a search firm, so we are seeing an increased use in search firms in board search. And I think, you know, within Canada, you could say that's a continuum of the professionalization of the board search process. And so we are looking for a more methodical and transparent process, which is important for organizations. Of course, there's new legislation and regulatory changes that are coming online from the OSC and others, such as Comply and Explain. And then again, finally, and obviously, is institutional pressure, right, for diverse boards, right?
You know, and on that note, it's really been quite interesting to see diversity go from being something that's been on the radar to catapulting into the single number one ask that we have on each and every search, whether it's a board search or an executive search. Boards and executive teams are very committed to this. And it's been, of course, a driving factor. As Ian mentioned, Comply and Explain started that journey. And then in recent years with world events, it's become increasingly and more emphasized. We've got organizations like the Black North Initiative that has just taken over 450 organizations that have actually pledged to take action on this front. You're having organizations that perhaps have not been vocal in the past who are now being much more vocal and standing up and challenging the status quo. As Ian mentioned, new legislation that is coming through and on the horizon incorporates has expanded the focus of diversity onto factors other than gender and is now more broadly and more inclusive in its definition. And then lastly, I don't know whether you were reading the most recent Conference Board of Canada report, but there was a retrospective look at board vacancies and how they were filled, so between 2011 and 2018. And remarkably, 50% were still filled by men, a quarter filled by women, and another quarter left either unfilled or eliminated altogether. So there's progress being made, but I do feel that there's a lot of progress still to be made, and there's hopefully more commitment that we'll see moving forward to get to the numbers and the equity and inclusion that we need. And so these are the things boards are thinking of, and that really play into their needs assessment and when we start on the recruitment side.
Yeah. And other broader, market factors we've seen, certainly the IPO environment in Canada, which has changed pretty significantly, over the last quarter or so. We've seen, I think, a record, listings in terms of IPOs, both in the TSX and TSX Venture. With that, we've seen clients moving, of course, from private to public organizations and the need to build out, public boards and proper boards. So that has increased demand. A lot of it has been technology driven with that sector raising capital through the public markets, which again, we haven't seen very often. And similarly, along with that, we've seen anecdotally slight increase in advertising, which is helpful as you look to new board roles to understand what's happening in the markets. We'll see more organizations being public, with their board needs and new roles. And so board talent trends here at Boyden, we did a global survey of 500 C-level executives across the world, across the globe, across every sector from April into May. And so some of the trends that have come out of that, and this report is coming out, I should mention, in a week or so. So we're happy to share that with anyone that's interested. But certainly seeing a lot of, 52% of boards realizing they need a different skill set in their board alignment and composition. Certainly, the past year has driven. You'd have to think part of that as far as how things have the digital and supply chain transformations organizations have impacted organizations. I thought, interestingly, from a sector perspective, private equity-backed companies have a larger percentage that are realizing that they need to really change up their board composition and skill set to meet some of the new realities they're seeing. And in our experience working with private equity firms, they're probably the most adamant or the biggest believer in the fact that talent drives valuation of an organization, or talent drives excellence in an organization. And so that's an interesting perspective they see at the board as well, the requirement for this. And industrials, of course, strong, and again, supply chain disruptions and other factors that have come into play. No doubt social factors are weighing into this as well. And what are sort of the in-demand skills? So again, some of the things we've talked about here: digital across the board, ESG, as we've talked about. Beyond that, it's really, global experience, communication and emotional intelligence. And we are hearing, almost as the final or part of the final step is that ability to collaborate and interact and work as a solid, cohesive team on the board. So is an important sort of litmus test that both candidates and boards are searching for as they look for their next board seat.
And so what kind of boards do we work with? And so it does run the gamut. So we see the not-for-profit. So these would be your hospitals, your charities, your associations and such. So not paid, but we see a lot of people actually starting off there because typically it may be something that they're passionate about or where they can contribute and give a lot of feedback and market value add. Lot less public scrutiny, so it's a nice safe space to begin your career and journey on the boards. On the not-for-profit side, though, we will highlight that on hospitals or foundations, it's almost a typical, an atypical split off of that, where people are looking for philanthropists, people who can help with the revenue generation and work with donors to increase the revenue streams there. Quasi-public sector falls into your crown corporations, your public agencies, and so on. So the Canada Posts of the world, the Via Rails, the OPGs, have varying levels of degree of pay. Some remuneration is retained as well as per diem rates, but that really does run the gamut in terms of the amounts.
And then on the private sector side, we do see, obviously, of course, private boards. We've got a few examples here. In our experience, when we're involved, certainly these boards mimic, as typically, they're how a publicly traded organization would put together a board in terms of assessing skill sets required, various competencies, backgrounds, et cetera. Less public scrutiny in this board, and that they are largely private, and you're not having AGMs and so on. But we are seeing our clients again really take a professional approach as you would see in a publicly traded organization. And then, of course, there's publicly traded boards, which clearly very familiar with, and that have, again, cover a lot of the topics that we're discussing here today. The one outlier here, an interesting type of board, is an advisory board. When we work with a lot of earlier stage, smaller businesses that are scaling, they will look as a step to bring aboard an advisory board, and typically it's commercially driven executives very tied to their business that may have, coming up to fresh retirement or another part of their career, and they look to these people both as door openers and really advisors, right? As the CEO and executive teams look to build out, it is an interesting way to come into the board environment and get that experience. As some of these organizations we're seeing now are moving from private and having advisory boards to now transforming those advisory boards into actual public boards as they do their IPOs. And so that really covers the gamut of types of boards that we see in our day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. And so once the board determines that there's a need, there's a vacancy, and they're going to go to market, so what do they do to determine what that looks like? And so whether you're doing a board search or an executive search, it starts with a needs analysis, taking the opportunity to reflect on where the organization is, what is the strategy moving forward, and looking at the talent around the table to determine what is it we're going to need to maintain the course and perhaps elevate or escalate in certain areas. And so this is typically done through a gap analysis. It'll come through and be depicted on a board competency matrix. And so we have a little sample here of what that might look like. So this is a sample. As I go through this, I would say that it looks like a public sector or quasi-public sector type of board. And the reason for this is that you've got your gender balance up front. You also have a very close lens on diversity other than gender. You've got regional representation, which is classic, whether you're on a federal or provincial or a regional type of public sector board. Then you have various committees and designations, as well as skill sets and competencies. And so if you break down this one in particular, you can see a few things come to light. And so the first one, obviously there's a need and there's an evolution where they're going to be looking for ESG and corporate social responsibility to bring that skill set onto the table. You're going to see that EDI and human resources are going to be factors that they'll want to bring onto the table and bring that value and lens to the corporate governance. Another one is around technology and cybersecurity. So talking again about some of these emerging trends that we're seeing. And then if you look more closely from a term standpoint, so crown corporations or public entities often have terms of up to 5 years or so, sometimes renewable. And so you see here that this individual, board member 6, has a term that's expiring this year. And so we have to go horizontally and see, well, chances are we're going to be looking for some skill sets there to complement once that person either steps down or if the person is not reappointed. And then lastly, you overlay gender. So ultimately, this exercise gives a nice picture of what you're looking for. So if I were to say, here is our challenge. This organization wants to replace or bring on a more gender balance. They only have 2 women. Diversity outside of gender is an important factor for this group. They want expertise in ESG and CSR, expertise in HR and EDI, an expert marketer, PR, and communications person. If I look at regions, if it is federal, they don't have anyone from the Atlantic provinces or the North, and so possibly that's going to be another one. And so all of a sudden, you've got a candidate pool that is broad and wide to something that is highly narrow and focused in one geography possibly, or 2, looking at very highly skilled expertise, and something that if you overlay gender, diversity, and all these other filters, you're into a very small pool of potential candidates. And therein lies the challenge and can sometimes constrain the ability to diversify. And so we see this happening, this tension happening with boards who are trying to diversify, but yet looking at what their needs are and finding ways to shift and change that up. And so again, over to you.
Yeah, and so we've talked about different types of boards, and while there are nuances between different types of boards, from Crown to public sector to privately held boards, there are really some common themes we are seeing in the market. Certainly diversity, as Michelle had elaborated on, is extremely important, and it's front and center with all of our discussions. Subject matter expertise, so thoughtfulness in terms of whether it is audit, right, for particular committees or particular markets, products, or ESG, which again is a newer, I think, trend we're seeing as far as being having on the environmental side, and clean tech side. Of course, senior management experience, any experience sitting on a board, even earlier, nonprofit experience, extremely important. So it's something that boards are, put under consideration. No doubt, industry market knowledge you would expect to be a factor. Credentials, so beyond that, just looking at general accomplishments, career trajectory, biography, those types of things do factor into profile review. Designations, of course, whether it's professional designations in particular. Commitment, of course, we talked about time and effort, which is very important, and motivation, right? So, one of the first questions we talk about with prospective candidates and clients is around the why. How is this appealing? How are you? The motivation behind it and the personal story behind it is important as well. And beyond that, the collaboration capability, be able to work within a team environment, but also to ask respectful, tough and critical questions, right? Which is what the organizations, whether it's investors, shareholders, CEOs are looking for, right, in today's direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, the chair will be instrumental in guiding and leading the organization and the board membership to have that experience, to build out and start looking at some of the soft skills, to also ensure that there's a succession plan in place and a performance review in place for the board as a whole from a governance standpoint. So all said, this is a team, and bringing those complements together will ensure that the team moves an organization forward. One of the things when you think about when you think about what corporate boards are looking for, from a candidate perspective, the reality, unfortunately, is that you can be stellar, but if the board doesn't have a given need at a particular time for someone with your skill set, and you're looking to join that board, the timing may just not be right for you at this time. So when you're thinking about different boards, think about that complement and that skill set and see if you're fitting that gap or that need that they may be having. So that's one factor that you may wish to think about as you're looking at boards. And the other one is people will be asking, why do you want this board? And if you're either not passionate about it or are unsure, or you're fishing for your first board role and that's what's driving you, I think that'll be fairly transparent early on, and your candidacy may be overlooked or passed on for that reason. And so, once we talk about what boards are looking for, then it comes into we recruit, and this is what can get produced. And
so this is a sample of again, you've seen the prior matrix, which is the board's evaluation, right, of their current structure and identification of needs. And from that, right, or through our discussions, we take that away, and we typically do have a candidate profile in mind, and we break that out into a matrix where perhaps we're aligning, core criteria that are required, and along with candidates, right? And there's sort of two ways we sometimes go to market and board searches. One is really it's an executive search like others, and so we understand the criteria, the type of profile person we're looking for. We craft our search strategy, and we go to market and start reaching out to prospective candidates, right? And that's through a variety of sources. That's through original research, understanding the profile, through resources such as BoardX. It's through our own database and network, and a variety of factors that we go and reach out and talk to candidates, right? The other way, which we also tend to go to market and across the board, could be, we're talking to the board and we understand the criteria, the particular profiles we're looking for, and they may say to us, we'd like to see 20 sample profiles, so a long list of 20. In that case, we are doing the research up front from publicly available sources. So when you see our evaluation here, in that instance, it's from our, if we don't know the person, it's from publicly available sources and our best educated guess or estimate from that. and then we're presenting that long list to the board. And from that, they're selecting candidates they would like us to reach out to. And in that case, it is important. Obviously, your public profile and experience, how that's communicated, is important, right? So that you are showing up, right, on these types of long lists. And this is, again, an evaluation. I should mention, though, through the process, this evaluation, it may start at one point, but as we start having discussions with prospective candidates, that might, of course, shift and change, right, as we understand better their core strengths and capabilities and where gaps may be there. Right?
Mm-hmm. And just building on that for a moment, Ian, there are certainly some pros and cons. And so when you go with your pre-long list, if you will, and you seek their prioritization and feedback on those potential candidates, the pros to that approach is that you are very sensitive to the messaging that you're able to convey to candidates. You know that the candidates who are going to be highly sought after are going to be profiles that the board is going to be interested in and the board is going to need. And so it's cutting out a process that perhaps might be much more broad, which is one aspect, but in this case, you're not going through motions if you're not a serious candidate. And so that's one definite benefit of having the prioritization in advance. It can take a little longer sometimes as a result, but more efficient in the back end. And then likewise, if we have a board say, no, please just go out, recruit and bring us candidates, that can be a little bit more expedited when we're talking about engaging candidates and bringing a vetted list to the board or to the committee.
Perfect. I just did see a question pop up. Maybe time to take a look at questions.
Yeah, happy to read a few out.
I saw the Q&A and in the chat as well. I just saw a question pop up.
Perfect. Yes. So the question that just popped up right now, what are you seeing in terms of numbers of candidates on a long and short list per vacancy?
Do you want to jump in on that, Ian, or I can?
Sure. Yeah. I would say a long list, typical long list that I'm working. So my clients would be private sector organizations. Through the search, likely 10 candidates down to a short list of 3 to a finalist is pretty typical.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say in the quasi public sector, it's much broader because of the lens of inclusivity and trying to keep it a much more open process. So I would say the long lists are typically longer and the short lists are typically a little longer as well, because if it goes through a ministerial or a cabinet approval, options have to be given. For every vacancy, multiple names will need to move forward, and that decision process is slightly different.
I'll put one more question forward, and then maybe we'll have another chance at the end. There have been a few questions about specifying a little bit more about diversity. So can we be more specific? And because it's such a broad term covering many equity groups, how do you square that? And what's your view on how to accelerate?
I think that mindful recruitment is how we square that, and we go into developing relationships and networks with various communities and various groups, whether it's BIPOC, whether it's Indigenous groups, LGBTQ. So we're trying to really hone in and establish relationships where these referrals can come out and we can have a better understanding of who might be eligible in there, who may not be raising their hands, but we can go in and bring them to the table. So I think you need to be quite mindful, and boards need to be mindful of that. And it's not a one check mark, but it's actually a full face complement of different perspectives.
So we had a few more questions come in during these responses. Maybe we'll do one more and then we'll move ahead. So I have one here. Is it absolutely critical to have an ICD designation to be considered for board candidacy?
I'll tackle what I see. So I see, is it absolutely critical to have a designation? I would say no. People are looking for that balance of expertise as well as designation. However, I would say if you are starting your board journey and you do not have it, and you do not have extensive working with boards, then it's getting to be a table stake. There are so many people out there right now with designations that all things created equal. I think the decisions, what I'm seeing is the decision is going to the person who has a designation. And I don't know whether Ian's seeing the same thing or not. I'd love to hear his thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The recent work we've done here has been, our clients have been seeking existing public markets board experience. In that case, in instance, a lot of them did have, frankly, have done the ICD, but it wasn't a specific criteria clients were seeing. But as Michelle said, if you're newer to the board world and you are looking to enter it, I think an ICD designation is worthwhile. And the people we've talked to certainly highly value their experience taking the course, both for the network and of course the knowledge they've gained during it. So certainly heard positive things about that whole
and there are a number of different programs. I mean, you've got the Directors College out of McMaster, you've got the equivalent in Quebec from Laval, you've got ICD. So I think that the education is out there.
Okay, I'll start the presentation again and we'll come back to questions.
All right, so looking at board recruitment in the process. And so the front end is all about getting ready to go to market. So number 1 and number 2, you do your gap analysis, you confirm what competencies we're looking for. And then 3 and 4, it's executing and bringing that talent to the table, as well as assessing against the selection criteria that you're looking for, and then interviewing and making the final decision. Now, typically, there's a few different processes. So you can look at a public call for nominations. You can look at targeted recruitment campaigns, informal referral processes, or a combination of all of the above. And in fact, when we get involved, it typically, or can be, all of the above. And so, I had an observation recently. Someone said to me, Michelle, we find that there's a lot more ads happening these days. What's going on? Are there more board vacancies? And, I speculate that no, the board vacancies are the same, but what's happening, I think, is that it's a reflection of COVID, and it's a reflection of the desire to diversify and bring talent to the table who may not be on the typical radar, and find new people for organizations. So they're trying to move beyond the traditional referrals. With COVID, you're not able to network like you once were able to, and so that's another way to do that. You're being more inclusive, and I see a lot of boards wanting to be more inclusive and looking at mechanisms. So how does that unfold when you're looking at a recruitment process? And so they're very mindful of that. And so we talked about the targeted versus the open process, but when we do the targeted, it falls into this campaign here. And so you get the phone call from the recruiter. Here we are. We share information. We have the executive brief. We confirm your interest. You have the interview and the discussion around what the committee is looking for, what it is that you have in your background, do you have time, and all the skill sets, etc. We then look at presenting to the committee, who determines the shortlist, who will be interviewed. Then, much like a typical process, really, you get into referencing and background checks, which are very important. And so from an executive recruitment standpoint, you would do full 360 peers, superiors, subordinates. In this case, we're really looking for other board members and possibly senior management to understand how you navigate governance. How do you work with other people, back to the soft skills that Ian referred to earlier on. And then finally, getting those final interviews and meetings underway so that you're talking very openly and candidly about the opportunity and the fit with the position. And then the decision point at the end of the day, and the announcement gets made.
And we get asked quite a bit, how long does the process take? And I think, what we see in the private sector certainly is it's accelerating, right? And oftentimes a lot of the recent work we've done, there's a particular reason as far as timeline they would like to follow, whether it's a public listing or an AGM or a particular need, burning need within on the board. And so, you could look at probably 3 months to be a typical process from end to end. And during that time, as Michelle shared, I mean, the amount of information shared with you as a candidate increases. So from the initial executive brief, high-level document, through to NDA signatures, through to really opening up a lot of detail around the business through the process as you look to make your final assessment as well around the business and opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And in the quasi-public sector world, that process can be anywhere from the 3-month mark to an extended year mark, simply because there are so many determinants and different decision-making points along the way. So it does take a lot longer for that. And then finally, what we also find is that with the not-for-profit board, sometimes the timing is generated by an unexpected vacancy and the need to have someone in place before an AGM. And so your AGM is actually going to be your driver in this case, so that you can have that next board meeting or that board meeting with an announcement of a candidate.
Questions?
I do have a few more questions that have come in.
Okay.
I'll start. There's several here. What is the likelihood of a not-for-profit executive getting on a private or public board, paid boards?
So high. So it depends on the experience and obviously the requirements of the private sector board, what they're looking for. Oftentimes we do see private sector board directors who started their board journey in the not-for-profit world and then have moved beyond that. And in many cases, it depends on their obviously career history, industry background, functional experience, and a number of other factors that we're looking for in the search. But that is usually a nice entry point into getting into paid board work for sure. And so we do see that, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And from for a not-for-profit, I think as a not-for-profit executive, one of the skill sets that's quite unique to that sector is the ability to navigate multiple stakeholders and multiple diverse stakeholder groups, and have that navigation, which is extremely helpful if you're trying to or looking at a public sector board because of the different nuances of a crown corporation, let's say.
Another question here asking to elaborate on ESG, mentioning that the social aspect of it is getting the least attention, and pointing out that environment is quite different from social and governance. So what part of ESG is getting a little bit more attention potentially?
Yeah, so in my experience, it has been the environment piece and implications to the business from that. And that's the client base where we work, and the implications, future implications, whether it's a large industrial organization or other type of private sector organization that they've been focused on. There are other areas. So it's been primarily on the environmental side, as I've seen. Michelle, you might have a different experience there.
It really depends on the board, I find. And so for some, they actually put ESG under with diversity, and so looking at that social component and the giving back. And I see that it emerges, and the definition actually changes depending on the audience, frankly. But it is gaining in the narrative, and I would expect, given especially some of the recent meetings from the government officials over the last month, that it's going to continue to trend in the right way. We see organizations even, so for example, if you think about CPPIB from a pension investment standpoint, some organizations are putting in policies around their investment policies that are looking at these kind of things. And so really driving home the importance on diversity, on ESG, and ensuring that they're upholding the public policy and agenda items that their mandate is probably set out to do.
Okay, I think 2 last questions. One here is, what percentage of board seats are filled by recruiters versus personal connections?
That's a good question, since we don't usually get called if it's a personal connection. Yeah. But I would say that very frequently, the the personal connection does play out, because board members, one of their roles is to identify talent, whether it's talent that they're going to need as board colleagues down the road. And so they're forever talking to people and trying to establish who might be out there. We often, during our process, will be given some referrals of board members. And so boards will give us some names. We'll go out and bring these people into the mix if they align with what the selection criteria looks for.
Okay, final question here. May you elaborate on referencing? What types of referees are best? Should it be directors you sit on boards with, a current former boss?
If you're referencing for a board role, definitely, if you have board colleagues who can speak to your abilities on that front, I would certainly focus on those individuals. We'll be asking questions like, what was the biggest challenge that you faced as a board over the course of your tenure or relationship with this person, and how did that play out? And so trying to look at your behaviors and some of the responses that you contributed to that board. Obviously, if you do not have those, then we'll want to get people who have worked closely with you and can really give us insight to what it's like to work with you closely at the table. Ian, sorry, and I'll just add to that if it's a public sector organization, they may ask for any stakeholders or shareholders that you've worked closely with in terms of understanding the outreach and that whole multidisciplinary and stakeholder type of environment, and how that either frustrates you or doesn't frustrate you.
Yeah, I would agree. We see that certainly. There could also be, I guess, former what you call professional like references. If for example, if it's a chief financial officer who is, talking about an audit chair role, then certainly prior director references, maybe references from their current board, if they're a current CFO, along with their CEO. Probably less likely to have 360 references in terms of former direct reports, more like peer references and people they've worked with, reported to in their prior or current role, right? Would be mostly what we see. Okay, great. Yeah, so we've added a few extra slides and further information, and I think a lot of these topics will be covered in the second session, which is July 21st, I believe, Joanna, and so looking forward to that. And now really pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Michelle Savoy, to hear firsthand of her experiences as a board candidate, who will join Michelle Richard for a fireside chat. Michelle Savoy is a corporate director serving on the boards of Laurentian Bank of Canada, where she's both chair of the HR and governance committee, Pizza Royalty Corp, as well as NAV Canada, where she chairs the governance committee. With over 25 years of experience in financial services and capital market industries, Michelle held several senior executive positions, including president of Capital Guardian Canada, the Canadian arm of Capital Group of Companies, a global investment management organization. We're very happy to welcome Michelle.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Michelle.
Excellent. Can you see me?
No, we're waiting for your video to emerge.
Oh, here we go. Someone had blocked my video. Here we go. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I had to put my headset on because I have neighbors that have decided to turn on some music very loudly.
Okay. Thought maybe they were watching the Portugal game this afternoon. Soccer fans. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to your thoughts and the reflections as a candidate of a board and an experienced board director yourself. And so one of the things that people often ask us that I would like to ask you is, tell us about how and when and why, and how did that board career start? What was your journey, and what was the pivotal moment that you decided to take that route?
Well, it's interesting. Everything that you talked about this afternoon is part of my journey, it seems. So my journey began on a not-for-profit board in the 90s. And I spent several years on not-for-profit boards. And then I was quite fortunate in 2012, just as I was retiring, a friend from IWF actually referred me to the Laurentian Bank, and I joined that board. A lot of people say your first corporate board is really important in terms of launching you. I kind of have a feeling that like it is. You know, I'm almost celebrating my 10th anniversary on that board. But I also have to say that surprisingly, I thought once I got one corporate board that it would be easy to, you know, land a second or so on. I kind of had ambitions to have more than one corporate board. And so surprisingly, it took 3 years for me to get my next board. But someone did give me advice at that point and said, you know, sometimes we spend more time saying no or trying to analyze whether it's the right board, the right portfolio mix, and whatnot. And that person said, just say yes. And so the moment I said yes, then things started happening, and 3 more boards came on at almost the same time. So then I had to, you know, basically stop and really focus on my portfolio. So that's a bit of a sense of my board career.
Interesting. And, you know, when we talk about the balance and that effective balance, did you find it challenging to find that right mix and or find that right time allotment?
Certainly starting 3 boards at the same time was extremely challenging. You know, the onboarding process, getting to know management in each of those companies, getting to know my fellow board members and understanding the industries, even though I was familiar with each of the industries, that was a lot to happen at one time. So I wouldn't recommend taking on 3 boards at the same time. In terms of load and balance at the moment, so I would say that it's once you get into a groove and you understand the business, understand your role, depending on what your role is, if you're a committee chair or not. I think that as an example, I would have capacity today to take on perhaps 1 more board. I think the issue of onboarding, which you talked about, is really important to keep an eye on. So the fact that I'm on 2 corporate boards, I think is watched carefully by companies that might consider my candidacy. Certainly if I had more than 4 corporate publicly traded boards, I would not be considered. So, you know, it sounds silly, but at 2, you know, I'm getting a little close, and I think that that probably weighs when I'm being evaluated as a board candidate.
Interesting. And as you reflect around the recruitment process, whether as a board member on a nominating committee or as a candidate going through it, are there specific elements to it that you find particularly challenging or surprising for that matter?
So, you know, that's a really interesting question, and I've sat on both sides of the table on this one. So, speaking as a candidate, you know, often you go into a board interview and you think, okay, I want to evaluate whether this is really of interest. I want to evaluate if I like the chair. I want to evaluate, you know, the culture of the board, you know, all these things that you kind of learn about. But the truth is, I think that the interview process for a board is very different than that of an executive position. So I think you mentioned earlier long lists of 10, short lists of 3. And if you think about a committee interviewing those 3 candidates on the short list, typically the committee will only meet that candidate once. You know, and if the candidate gets through that interview process, then the candidate will then meet the CEO and potentially the chair on their own. But that selection process really happens with that interview. So I would say the thing that surprised me is that while you might want to evaluate, you know, your options as you're going to an interview, and I think you made the point earlier, I think it's really important to show your passion for the role, show your passion for the company, and why you would be a great board candidate. You've just got one shot at it. And I think that's probably what surprised me the most.
And how will being on the other side of the table, your observations as being that selection committee?
So being on the other side of the table, so I want to just talk a little bit about that motivation perhaps, is that often I have found that when you ask people why they want to do board work, it's more about them rather than, so, you know, some people will answer the question and say they want to be on board to stay intellectually curious, or they want to be on boards, you know, to, because they really like the banking sector, or, you know, they understand the pizza business or whatever. But the truth is that I think it's important to prepare in terms of why you want to be on that board vis-a-vis that skills matrix that you referred to, and how you can fill those gaps. And I think it's really important to make the motivation about your contribution to that board, rather than, many people say, well, now that I'm not working, you know, I have time to commit to a board. And I understand how that would be true compared to when you were working, but it's more about you rather than about the company. And I think there's so many challenges right now that companies are facing, that it's really important to differentiate yourself from a contribution perspective, and to offer observations around what you talked about today, like ESG, cybersecurity, technology. You may not be an expert in any of those things, but you can take your background and apply it to all of those categories. And I think that that would make for a great dialogue in an interview process, which would be great.
A great way to differentiate. Great, very, very good points. Now I'm looking at time, and we do want to have some time for the audience's questions, because I'm sure that I see them lining up here as we're talking. Is there one tip or piece of advice that you would share with the audience today that we haven't talked about?
I think the biggest one would be, and perhaps it shows my ignorance or my naivete when I first joined a corporate publicly traded company board, is everything is out there for you to prepare. So as an example, and I'll admit this freely, I'm not sure that I had gone through a proxy circular fully, you know, to understand what a board has done, what a company has done. So I would have gone to an annual report to prepare for a board interview, but I might not have done, you know, the AIF or the proxy circular. And there is so much in there about the functioning of committees, the functioning of the board, what the board's accomplishments the year prior, some of the challenges that might have occurred dealing with all of the items, including ESG, technology, and the skills matrix. So I would say the one piece of advice is, when you prepare, is don't be as silly as I was. Just go and look at the proxy circular of prior years in addition to the annual report. It will give you all the information that you need to be prepared and be able to differentiate yourself.
Well, words of wisdom. This is great. Now I'm going to turn to the question period here now. And Joanna, I think you're fielding those for us.
Yes. So I do have one question here that I'm ready to share. And if any more come in, we're happy to take a look at those. Have you ever been the first or only female board director? And if so, how did you approach that environment?
So no, I've always been second or third. And funny enough, I think I might have said early on in a bit of a Calaverian fashion, is that I'm not sure I would join a board if I was the first woman on the board. And I can't believe I would have said that, you know, because I think people have said that it would be more difficult if you were the first. For sure, it would not be as easy to be the first woman on a board. And for sure, I've been very fortunate that that has not occurred to me. But I think, you know, as you talked about today, all the IPOs that have come out recently in technology, you know, I'm sure that there are probably firsts in terms of women, diversity, and so on those boards. And I think that that would present many opportunities for people on this call.
Just following up on that for a moment. So based on your own experience, as well as the anecdote of your colleagues and networks who are on current boards, is there a culture? Are you feeling the shift from a culture perspective? when it comes to diversity and these new skill sets?
So I'm definitely feeling the shift, and but I have to say I'm on a bank board, and a bank board, I think they're more advanced. We're 50%, diverse, women and men. And I am feeling the shift a little bit, almost to the detriment of women. I'm just going to say that up front, in that it feels like the funnel has narrowed even more, where we are now not just looking to add women on boards, but we're looking to add women of color. And so, all of a sudden it's, oh, you're just a woman, So I hope that as we approach this diversity card, that we should be adding women, and we should be adding women of, cultural, diverse backgrounds, but not one at the exclusion of the other. So I'm seeing that a little bit. Certainly the shift that I saw when I joined Laurentian Bank Board after I joined it, is there was a tendency, and you may want to talk about this, for boards to shrink a little bit in size. And then the skills matrix came in, and it felt like the skills matrix kind of narrowed the skill set to almost at the exclusion of women. But now here we are in 2021, and I do feel like there is tremendous strides happening. But I hope that we don't dilute it just because we've added one more layer of diversity in our quest to add to that.
Yeah, one of the things I've been noticing is that boards are, rather than having the hard conversations or looking at terms or renewing in a different way, they're opting to add another board seat to help bring that complement in. Is that something that you're also finding, rather than the terms or the performance ratings of various members?
I haven't seen that yet on my boards, but I think I have seen it, in the public sector for sure, and I think that's great.
I have one final question, and then we can close off. How do you use your network to refer and promote potential board members?
So that's a very good question, and I think networks are really important. And I'll share with you a piece of advice that was given to me by a fellow board member at Laurentian Bank, who explained to me that someone had given her the advice that if she wanted to find a board, she had to network. And so she was probably about 10 or 15 years my senior. And the networking that was recommended to her was make a list of all board members on a first name basis. So that implies a certain connection with those individuals, and just reach out to them and network and let them know that you are looking to get on a board. So I've actually tried that, and I did that for my next few boards, which were the 3 that came in 2015. And I must say all of those boards came via referrals or connections. But I think, as Michelle, you pointed out in your presentation, it feels like there's more being done through recruiters today for transparency reasons, and perhaps less on referrals. And to share my experience on Laurentian Bank, we have, I would say 90% of the time, we have used now executive recruiting firms. We recently did do one through our referrals, but it was a very specific request. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of networking for board work. It's no different than if you're looking for a job.
Yeah, absolutely. Great closing remark. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll take a close to the Q&As and invite Judy Cohen for our conclusion from IWF. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank you very, very much, Boyden, for an extraordinarily informative presentation this afternoon. As Vice Chair of IWF's Member Engagement Committee, I'm thrilled that this masterclass series is off to such a strong start. And on behalf of IWF's Toronto chapter, I'd like to thank Joanna for her masterful coordination of this entire series of classes, which are yet to come with today's strong start. Thank you very much, Michelle and Ian, for your invaluable tips and insights into the recruitment process, the changing skills that boards are looking for, and the machinations of those very complex board matrices. The thing that both Michelle and Ian have done is challenged us to use, to think about some big questions that we must be able to answer. What are you passionate about, and why do you want to be on this board? And that really was reiterated by our very own Michelle Savoy, who so generously shared her rich board experience and advice by saying, you must really think about that, and you must be in a position to understand. Not talk about what you're interested in and be focused on yourself, but rather be focused on what skills boards are looking for. Michelle's other great tip was on networking. So networking and connections are still very strong, so let's not give up on any of that. Thank you all very much to our IWF members for taking the time to join us today. And our next masterclass in the series is on July 21st from 4 to 5 p.m. again. If you haven't already registered, it's not too late. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with everyone. And on that note, I wish everyone a lovely evening.